The autistic son of a powerful Greenwich, Connecticut tycoon had lived in a world of silence since his mother's tragic death. No amount of money or expert could penetrate the wall of pain the boy had built around himself. Until the new cleaning lady, a humble woman carrying her own wounds from the past, did something no one expected and, with a simple gesture, found the key to the family's heart. But before we discover how her silent empathy healed what money couldn't buy, we want to know, from which city are you watching, and what time is it there? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and let's explore this moving story together. The autumn morning arrived in Greenwich, Connecticut, with a cold, crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the murky confusion that pervaded the Ashford mansion. The pale sun fell on the perfectly manicured lawn, making the dew sparkle like millions of tiny diamonds. But inside the stone and glass house, no light seemed capable of dispelling the shadows. Silence was the strongest presence in the house. It was not the stillness of peace, but a heavy, institutional silence, like that of a library or a museum, where life seemed something to be observed from a distance, not lived. Every marble surface and every dark wood panel reflected an image of sterile perfection, a testament to James Ashford's wealth and a monument to the absence of his late wife. On this particular day, the silence seemed to have teeth, biting at the nerves of all who dared breathe within its domain, foreshadowing the storm brewing outside its protective walls. Sarah Jenkins felt the silence like a physical pressure against her eardrums. She was in Daniel's room, a space that should have been a childhood refuge but felt more like a designer furniture showroom. Today, her hands, which for months had learned the language of cleanliness and then care, were focused on a task that seemed the strangest of all: dressing Daniel for battle. The small button-down shirt and cashmere sweater felt like a costume, armor unsuitable for a 7-year-old. As she smoothed the boy's hair, Sarah maintained a forced smile and hummed a soft melody, an island of calm in an ocean of anxiety. Inside, however, her stomach was a knot of ice. She was the caretaker, the protector, the only one who understood Daniel's silent world, and now she was being taken to a place where she would have to translate that world into a language she didn't know, that of the law. Downstairs, in his office that resembled the command center of a corporate empire, James Ashford moved with the precision of a caged predator. He was already wearing a suit, a piece of Italian tailoring that cost more than Sarah's car, but which today seemed as useful as paper armor. He paced back and forth, the phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to his legal team. His voice was controlled, sharp, the tone of a man accustomed to winning, to dominating any room he entered. Yet there was a tension in his jaw, a glint of desperation in his eyes that betrayed his facade of power. He could move markets and bring down competitors, but he was utterly powerless to protect his son from this public humiliation. This lawsuit wasn't about business. It was about his failure as a father, a failure that Sarah's quietly competent presence in his home only made more evident to him with each passing day. The moment before they left was charged with an unspoken electricity. The three of them met in the grand entrance hall, a cavernous space with a crystal chandelier that resembled a frozen sun. James ended his call, his face a mask of cold determination. Sarah walked down the stairs with Daniel, holding his small hand tightly. For a moment, time stood still. Daniel, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, released Sarah's hand and walked to an abstract bronze sculpture that stood in the center of the hall. He ran his little fingers over the cool, smooth surface of the metal, exploring its form, completely absorbed in his own tactile world. James and Sarah watched the scene, and their eyes met over the boy's head. Neither smiled. It was a look of forced alliance, a silent acknowledgement that despite the social gulf between them, that day they were each other's only allies, fighting for the soul of this small, innocent explorer of sculptures. The drive to the Stamford courthouse was made inside the silent bubble of a luxury German sedan. The leather smelled of richness, and the climate control system kept the air perfectly tempered, insulating them from the crisp New England autumn breeze streaming through the tinted windows. The outside world seemed vibrant and carefree, with people in cafes and colorful leaves falling from the trees. Inside the car, however, the atmosphere was stifling. Sarah held Daniel in her lap, her body forming a protective shield around him. She pointed at things outside, a dog, a school bus, in an attempt to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but her voice was a strained whisper. James sat in the front seat next to the driver, staring intently at the road, the profile of his face carved from granite. He was a statue of restrained anxiety. Sarah's mind wasn't on the Connecticut landscape. She was light years away, in a small house in the Midwest with her younger brother, Kevin. She remembered with painful clarity how he flinched at loud noises, how the other boys called him weird, how the teachers, with all good intentions, tried to force him to be normal. She remembered the school meetings, the psychologists, the evaluations. She remembered watching her brother's spirit wither under the weight of judgment from a world that had no patience for her pace. Today's hearing felt like a repeat of that same story, but on a much larger and crueler scale. The anonymous report to CPS was the sophisticated equivalent of the vicious whispers in the schoolyard, and she, once again, was in the role of advocate for a boy the world refused to understand. The pain of that old wound fueled her determination. James, meanwhile, was lost in a maze of strategy and regret. He mentally replayed conversations with his lawyers, the potential questions, the gaps in his rivals' arguments. He was a master at anticipating his enemies' moves on the corporate chessboard. But this wasn't a game of chess. The central piece was his son's heart. The allegation, though fabricated by a competitor, had a kernel of truth that tortured him. He had been an absent father. He hid at work after his wife's death, using mergers and acquisitions as an anesthetic for grief. It was Sarah, with her simplicity and insight, who showed him the depth of his emotional neglect. And now, ironically, the rival he despised was using the very person who had begun to heal his family as the weapon to destroy it. It was a knot of guilt, anger, and fear so tight he could barely breathe. Arriving at the courthouse was a sensory assault. As soon as the car stopped, a mob of reporters and photographers descended upon them like a swarm. Camera flashes exploded, momentarily blinding them. Microphones were thrust in their direction. "Mr. Ashford, what is your response to the allegations of neglect? Who is the woman with your son?" James reacted with protective instinct. He exited the car first, his large, imposing body forming a barrier. His face was a mask of icy fury. "Make way," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah came out the other side, instinctively turning Daniel against her shoulder, her hand covering his ear to muffle the screams and chaos. She felt Daniel's small body tremble against hers, and her fear turned to fierce, protective anger. They were treating her boy's pain like a spectacle. The courtroom's interior was a palace of coldness. The polished marble floor reflected the fluorescent lights from the high ceiling, making everything appear pale and clinical. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the cavernous hallway, each one resonating with an oppressive gravity. The place was designed to intimidate, to remind everyone of the smallness of the individual before the majesty of the law. To James, accustomed to environments of power, it was just another battlefield. But to Sarah, who had never been in such a place, it felt like a cathedral dedicated to a strange and merciless God. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the stone walls could see right through her, seeing all her insecurities and fears. It was an environment hostile to the very idea of human warmth and empathy she represented. The feeling of being an outsider intensified as they sat down to wait. The hallway was filled with lawyers in impeccable suits, talking in hushed tones, their leather briefcases reeking of power and privilege. Sarah was wearing the simplest, most formal dress she owned, a garment she hoped would make her seem invisible but instead made her stand out. She felt the curious, appraising eyes sliding over her. She could almost hear the thoughts. That's her, the nanny, the cleaning lady. The labels reduced her, boxed her in, denying the complexity of who she was and what she had done. To steady herself, she focused on Daniel's small hand, which was being tended by James's cousin in a separate room. The memory of his touch was her anchor, a tangible reminder of why she was willing to endure this humiliation. Time on the wooden bench outside the courtroom seemed to have its own physics. Seconds dragged on like minutes, minutes like hours. Anxiety was a metallic taste in Sarah's mouth. She could hear the muffled sounds of life continuing on the other side of the walls, a door closing, phones ringing, distant laughter, and it seemed surreal that the world hadn't stopped for the calamity about to unfold in her life. James didn't sit. He remained standing, hands in his pockets, staring at a fixed point on the opposite wall. His stillness was more revealing than any rhythm of anxiety. It was the stillness of a man who had lost control and didn't know what to do with himself. The stillness between him and Sarah was no longer strange. It was a heavy solidarity, the bond of two soldiers waiting for the order to advance across a minefield. James's rival's legal team arrived, moving down the hallway with the confidence of someone who already considered themselves the victor. The lead attorney, an older man with an air of complacency, gave James a barely perceptible nod, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and an insult. His eyes passed over Sarah without even registering her, as if she were a shadow or a piece of furniture. To them, she wasn't a person, but evidence, a piece of equipment to be used and discarded to prove their point. This utter dehumanization was, in some ways, more frightening than open hostility. It showed that, in their world, people like her were faceless and voiceless. They were merely collateral damage in the war of the Titans. Finally, a door opened, and a court official with a bored expression called their case. Custody hearing in the case of Daniel Ashford. The formality of the announcement, the way Daniel's name was pronounced in that clinical tone, made Sarah's stomach churn. It was time. James turned to her, his face an impenetrable mask, but for a split second his eyes revealed a deep panic. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to, and then let it fall. "Let's go," was all he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah took a deep breath, the air feeling like ice in her lungs, and stood. She felt as if she were walking to her own execution, but the image of Daniel's smile, a smile she had helped bring back into the world, propelled her forward. The courtroom was exactly as she had feared, impersonal, dominated by dark wood, and the American flag hanging solemnly behind the judge's raised bench. The place smelled of floor polish and ancient anxiety. They took their places at the defense table, a space that seemed small and vulnerable compared to the vastness of the room. Sarah sat with her back perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap to hide her trembling. She felt like a wild animal, trapped in a metal trap, surrounded by hunters who spoke a language she didn't understand and had no interest in learning hers. The layout of the room was inherently adversarial, designed for conflict, not understanding, and she knew the silent truth she carried in her heart would have difficulty surviving in such a place. Judge Annabelle Sterling entered, and everyone rose in a rehearsed ritual. She was a woman in her 60s with impeccably combed gray hair and a face that seemed sculpted by experience and limited patience. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of emotion. She represented the law in its purest and most frightening form, logical, impartial, and potentially blind to the nuances of the human condition. As she sat down and began leafing through the paperwork, Sarah felt a chill. This woman, with a single blow of her gavel, had the power to ratify Sarah's greatest joy or inflict her greatest pain, and her decision would be based not on what she felt, but on what could be proven. The proceedings began with a litany of legal jargon that sounded like a foreign language to Sarah. James's attorney and his rival's attorney exchanged motions and citations, a formal dance of verbal combat. Their names were mentioned repeatedly, but in a way that stripped them of their identity. They became the petitioner, James Ashford, the caregiver, Sarah Jenkins, and the minor, Daniel Ashford. The words turned them into abstractions, mere nouns in a legal document. Sarah heard her name and barely recognized it. The woman described in those papers, the unqualified domestic worker, was not her. She was a ghost, a caricature created to serve a narrative that was not her own. Then James's rival's attorney took the stand for his opening statement. He spoke with a calm, professorial confidence which made it all the more devastating. He didn't lash out in anger. He built a prison of twisted logic around them. He depicted James as an overwhelmed, emotionally incapable billionaire who, in an act of desperation, had abdicated his parental responsibilities to a low-level employee. He painted Sarah not as a savior, but as an opportunist, or, at best, a well-meaning but dangerous amateur whose interference was creating an unstable and unconventional environment for a child with special needs. Every word was chosen to plant seeds of doubt and fear. Child's Agent Protective Services, CPS, who had visited the home, a middle-aged man with a tired appearance, he took the stand and answered questions factually and monotonously. He confirmed that an anonymous tip had been received. He confirmed that the primary caregiver was uncertified. He confirmed that the arrangement was highly irregular. While he admitted that the home was clean and that the child did not appear to be in immediate physical danger, his bureaucratic and neutral language ultimately reinforced the prosecution's narrative. He was not a villain. He was simply part of a system that, by its very nature, was suspicious of anything that didn't fit into its predefined boxes and forms. As the CPS agent spoke, Sarah felt the ground crack beneath her feet. The truth was being twisted into something unrecognizable. Her connection with Daniel, born of empathy and experience, was being labeled irregular. Her care, which had brought the boy back from an abyss of silence, was being presented as a risk. She looked at James and saw the same helpless frustration on his face. They were trapped in a nightmare where the language of bureaucracy and innuendo was more powerful than the language of the heart. She clenched her hands so tightly that her nails dug into her skin, the small physical pain a welcome distraction from the anguish that threatened to suffocate her. James's attorney, a forceful woman named Maria, gave the agent a brief and incisive cross-examination, forcing him to admit that Daniel seemed calm, safe, and connected to his caregiver. But the damage was already done. The image of an irregular situation had been firmly planted in the judge's mind. The prosecution's attorney smiled subtly, believing he had laid a solid foundation for his attack. He turned to the judge, preparing to call his next witness, likely a psychologist paid to theorize about the dangers of inappropriate attachments. The room waited. The scales of justice seemed to be tipping dangerously against them. It was then that James's attorney stood up again and, in a clear voice that cut through the tension, said, "Your Honor, the defense calls Ms. Sarah Jenkins to the stand." The walk from the defense table to the witness stand seemed to take an eternity. For Sarah, each step was a monumental effort, as if she were walking against an invisible current. The sound of her own shoes on the polished floor was unnaturally loud in the stillness of the room, marking a funereal rhythm toward her destination. The fluorescent overhead lights seemed blinding, and the faces in the gallery became a blur of colors and indistinct shapes. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on her, each with their own theory, their own judgment. To survive the walk, she focused on a single point, the empty wooden chair that awaited her. It became her only destination, her only reality. She didn't look at James, fearing that the expression on his face would shatter the fragile shell of composure she had built around herself. In that moment, she was completely alone. Placing her left hand on the Bible and raising her right was an act laden with a weight that went far beyond the law. The book's leather cover was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. As the court official recited the oath in a rehearsed monotone, Sarah's mind was elsewhere. The formal words, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth," mingled with a silent, much deeper promise she made in her heart. It was an oath to her late brother Kevin, that she would honor his memory by giving voice to another silent boy. It was an oath to Daniel, that she would fight for his peaceful world with every fiber of her being. When she finally responded, her voice was surprisingly firm, and "I swear" that echoed with the conviction of a lifetime of experience, pain, and love. The fear hadn't disappeared, but now it was channeled into unwavering purpose. James's attorney, Maria, began her cross-examination with a calculated gentleness, designed to calm both the witness and herself. Her first questions were like an outstretched hand in a dark room. "Ms. Jenkins, can you tell us how you came to work for the Ashford family?" Sarah took a deep breath and the words began to flow, a little shakily at first. She didn't talk about the job posting or the salary. Instead, she described her first impressions of the mansion. She spoke of a silence so profound it seemed weighted, of hallways so vast and empty that her own footsteps echoed back to her like those of a ghost. She described the impeccable, cold beauty of a place where everything was in its rightful place, except joy. She painted a picture not of luxury, but of monumental loneliness, establishing for the court the emotional desert in which James and Daniel lived before her arrival. "And what was your first meaningful encounter with Daniel like?" Maria asked softly. Sarah paused, her eyes drifting to a distant point as the memory flooded her. She described the sound that led her to him. Not the cry of a spoiled child, but a hum of anguish, a low repetitive sound of suppressed pain. She detailed the scene with a precision that made the room hold its breath. The boy huddled in a corner of his spacious room, rocking back and forth, his forehead gently banging against the wall in a steady rhythm. "When I saw him," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion, "I didn't see a child with a problem. I recognized the scene. I saw my brother Kevin. I knew he wasn't trying to hurt himself. He was trying to find himself. He was trying to create a sensation in a world that gave him none." So I said nothing. I just sat on the floor, a safe distance away, and began to rock in time with him. And for the first time that day, he stopped and looked at me. As soon as Maria finished, the prosecuting attorney stood, his previous gentleness fading to reveal a cold, calculating aggression. He leaned closer, his posture that of a seasoned interrogator. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice sharp, "you just described the complex behavior of a child with special needs. And you, a cleaning lady by trade with no medical training, no certification in child psychology, absolutely no formal qualifications, thought it appropriate to intervene on your own?" He emphasized the word cleaning lady with a subtle disdain, designed to disarm her, to frame her as an ignorant, presumptuous amateur. The question hung in the air, a direct challenge not only to her actions but to her very identity and her right to have acted compassionately. The veiled insult, instead of intimidating Sarah, had the opposite effect. It ignited a flame of dignity within her. She sat up straighter in her chair, her shoulders back, and fixed her calm eyes on the lawyers. When she spoke, her voice was low, but each word was delivered with a conviction that demanded attention. "You're right. I don't have diplomas framed on the wall. My qualifications didn't come from a university," she said, her speech slow. "My qualifications came from sleepless nights trying to understand why my brother screamed. They came from learning to differentiate a touch that soothed from one that frightened. They came from celebrating the first time he managed to tie his shoes, a victory that to the world was nothing, but to us was everything. My qualifications, sir, were forged in 15 years of unconditional love, and there is no university in the world that teaches that. There is no certificate that can validate that kind of knowledge." The lawyer, realizing his attack on her profession had failed, decided to deliver a more personal low blow. He shuffled through his papers theatrically before looking up. "Speaking of your brother, Miss Jenkins, our records indicate that your brother Kevin passed away tragically a few years ago," he said, his voice falsely sympathetic. "Given your deep emotional involvement and your lack of training, how can this court be sure that you are not simply projecting your own history, your own unresolved grief, onto this vulnerable child? How can we know that this is not a desperate attempt to fix in Daniel what you could not fix in your own brother?" The cruelty of the question was like a punch to Sarah's stomach. He was using her deepest loss, her most sacred pain, as a weapon to discredit her. At the defense table, James Ashford couldn't take it anymore. A low, furious growl escaped his lips and he moved to stand, his face a mask of suppressed fury. Maria, his attorney, reacted with lightning speed, her hand landing firmly on his arm, forcing him to remain seated. "James, no, it's what he wants," she whispered urgently. Then she stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The attorney is harassing the witness, making cruel insinuations and exploiting a family tragedy that has no relevance to this case." Judge Sterling looked at the prosecuting attorney over her glasses, and for the first time, a clear expression of displeasure appeared on her face. "Counselor, you are treading on dangerous ground. The objection is granted. Stick to the facts of this case." The public rebuke was a small but significant victory for the defense. Despite the judge's intervention, the poisonous question still hung in the air. Sarah knew she needed to answer it, not for the lawyer, but for herself, and for her brother's memory. She took a deep breath, finding a center of calm amidst the storm of emotions. "My brother Kevin didn't need to be fixed," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with unshakable conviction. "He was perfect, just the way he was. What he needed was understanding. He needed patience. My brother's tragedy wasn't his condition. It was having to live in a world that wasn't willing to slow down to walk alongside him. I didn't fail my brother. I loved him. The world failed him, and I promised myself I would never stand by and watch that happen to another child again." Her words weren't a defense, they were a testament to her philosophy of life. At that moment, something shifted in the room. Judge Annabelle Sterling slowly put down her pen. She leaned back in her chair and fixed Sarah with her gaze. But it was no longer the gaze of an impartial evaluator of the law. It was the gaze of a woman, of a person who was truly listening. The facade of professional neutrality dissolved, revealing genuine curiosity and respect. The power dynamics in the courtroom had completely reversed. The unqualified cleaner had become the moral authority, the teacher, the only person who spoke with the wisdom that only lived experience can provide. The prosecuting attorney felt the change in the temperature of the room, and for the first time, A shadow of uncertainty crossed her confident face. Maria, sensing the favorable change, stood and guided Sarah back to her territory. "Ms. Jenkins, the attorney seems confused about your lack of training. Please educate this court. Tell us about Daniel's language." And so, Sarah began to translate the boy's silent world. She spoke of how the way he stacked his wooden blocks was a diary of his emotions. Tall, neat towers signified a calm day. Crooked, unstable towers, a day of anxiety. Blocks scattered on the floor, a rare burst of joy and relaxation. She described how he expressed yes not with his head, but with a slow, deliberate blink and no by turning his face to the left. She wasn't describing a disorder. She was describing a culture, a complex and nuanced language. She then spoke about her discovery of music, how the therapies with agitated children's songs only overwhelmed him, but how one day, while dusting, she began humming an old folk song her mother used to sing, a simple, melancholy melody. Daniel, who was in his corner, stopped what he was doing and turned his head toward her, tilting it like a curious bird. That afternoon, she sat close to him and sang the same song in a whisper. She described to the court the miraculous sight of Daniel's first genuine smile, a smile that wasn't just a movement of lips, but that lit up his entire face. He didn't need noise and forced joy, Sarah explained. He needed a melody that matched the stillness of his soul. He needed permission to be peaceful. "And speech?" Maria asked. "The accusation is based on the fact that he's nonverbal." Sarah shook her head gently. "He's not nonverbal. He talks all the time. We're the ones who are deaf to his language," she corrected. "Words for Daniel are like foreign objects. He doesn't understand why he needs to use them when he already communicates so well in other ways. My job wasn't to force him to speak our language. It was to show him that I was willing to learn his. And when he felt safe, when he knew he was understood, that's when he began to take an interest in our words. Not as a command, but as a curiosity. As a new way to connect with someone he finally trusted." She was dismantling the very premise of the case, the idea that Daniel's silence was a deficit. With each answer, Sarah painted an increasingly detailed and intimate portrait of Daniel, one no psychological report or formal evaluation could capture. She spoke of how he hated the smell of citrus cleaning products but was soothed by the scent of lavender. She recounted how he arranged the rocks he found in the garden by texture, not color or size, small, trivial details to the world, but which were the cornerstones of Daniel's universe. She spoke with the authority of someone who had dedicated not only her time, but her soul, to understanding another human being. She was no longer defending herself. She was defending the validity of Daniel's inner life, demanding that the world see him not as a collection of symptoms, but as a whole and complex person. "The prosecution, Ms. Jenkins, suggests that your bond is harmful, a fantasy of yours," Maria said, her voice firm. "They need evidence they can understand, something they can write down in their notebooks. Is there anything that can concretely show this court the nature of Daniel's trust in you?" The question was a direct challenge. Sarah knew that to those logical and skeptical minds, her words, however sincere, could be dismissed as sentimental. She needed something they could see, touch. She took a deep breath and looked at James. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. He knew what she was going to do. He nodded, a barely perceptible permission, but one that meant everything. With a slow movement, James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, smooth object. He stood and, with a solemnity that silenced the room, walked to the podium and placed the object on the wooden ledge in front of Sarah. It was a smooth gray stone, the size of a quail's egg, polished from years of handling. The prosecuting attorney rose to object to the theatrical display, but Judge Sterling silenced him with a look. "Explain, Ms. Jenkins," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, but her eyes filled with intense curiosity. Sarah took the stone, its familiar warmth filling her palm. "This is Daniel's calm stone," she said. "When the world gets too loud or scary, he holds it. It's his anchor. He rarely lets go, and he only gives it to someone when he feels completely safe, when he knows that person will hold not only the stone, but also his fears. This morning, before we came here, he placed it in my hand. The impact of that small gray stone was more powerful than any legal document." The room fell into stunned silence. The evidence was simple, undeniable, and deeply human. Maria let the moment breathe, allowing the truth to sink in before asking her final question. She stepped back slightly, giving Sarah the full space in the room. "Ms. Jenkins, my last question is the most important. Mr. Ashford offered you a generous salary, but you could have refused. You could have left when the press got involved, when your name was dragged through the mud. Why did you stay? Why risk everything for this family?" The question echoed in the silence, demanding an answer that went to the heart of everything that had happened. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't need to think about the answer. She lived it every day. She looked directly at James, but her answer was for the whole room, for the whole world. "Because when I first walked into that house, I didn't see a mansion. I saw a beautiful mausoleum, a place where pain and grief had frozen everything. I saw a brilliant boy drowning in an ocean of silence, and I saw a kind-hearted father drowning in an ocean of sadness. And their silence didn't scare me," her voice broke, "because I recognized it. It was the language my brother spoke. It was my native tongue. I stayed because I knew that, perhaps for the first time in my life, I was in a place where I was the only person in the world who could translate." A profound silence followed her statement. It was as if a wave had swept through the room, washing away all hostility, all cynicism, leaving behind only the stark truth of her words. The prosecuting attorney was pale. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew any further questions would be futile. He had lost the case not to a superior legal argument, but to an overwhelming display of love and humanity. When the judge turned to him, he simply shook his head. "I have no further questions, Your Honor." James's rival tycoon looked shocked, as if he couldn't comprehend that his multi-million-dollar strategy had been dismantled by the sincerity of a cleaning lady. "The witness is excused," Judge Sterling said, her voice noticeably softer. Sarah's walk back to her seat was the opposite of the first. Her legs were firm, her head held high. She didn't look at the gallery or the prosecution team. Her gaze was fixed on James. As she sat, he leaned over and whispered, his voice choked with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you, Sarah." It wasn't the thank you of a boss to an employee. It was the thank you of a man who had just witnessed someone save his family's soul. And in the look they exchanged, the hierarchy that had once defined them dissolved forever, replaced by a respect and partnership forged in the fires of that ordeal. When Sarah returned to her seat, a thick, emotionally charged silence hung over the courtroom. It was as if the dust of the verbal battle had settled, revealing a field of emotional truths no one could ignore. The air was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of the sincerity everyone had just witnessed. Beneath the table, away from the gaze of the gallery, James's hand found Sarah's, giving it a firm, quick squeeze. It wasn't a gesture of romance or patronizing comfort. It was an act of pure solidarity, a silent acknowledgement that transcended the barriers of class and circumstance that separated them. In that simple touch, he said what words could not. "You are not alone. I am with you." And for Sarah, that small gesture was an anchor, a reminder that regardless of the legal outcome, the human victory had already been achieved. Attorney Maria rose for her closing arguments, her posture exuding a confidence not present earlier in the day. She didn't address the judge with a torrent of legal jargon, but with a simplicity that echoed Sarah herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "The law provides us with guidelines, protocols, and definitions, but the law at its core was created to serve humanity, not the other way around. Today we hear about qualifications. The prosecution would have us believe that qualifications are found on a piece of paper, on a diploma. But the defense argues that the deepest qualification, the only one that truly matters when it comes to a child's well-being, is the ability to see another human being in their entirety. Ms. Jenkins may not have a degree in psychology, but she has a doctorate in empathy, a degree in patience, and a lifetime of experience in unconditional love. And that, Your Honor, is the only qualification that should matter to this court today." In stark contrast, the prosecuting attorney rose to his closing arguments looking defeated. His confidence had drained, replaced by a defensive rigidity. He tried almost pathetically to return to his original points, harping on the importance of certified professional care and the risks of unconventional arrangements. But his words, which had once seemed logical and persuasive, now sounded hollow, technical, and cruelly inhuman. It was like trying to explain the laws of thermodynamics to someone warming themselves by a campfire. The emotional, visceral truth Sarah had presented had rendered his arguments cold and irrelevant. He felt the eyes of the room on him, not with agreement but with subtle contempt. He finished his speech hurriedly, knowing that every word he spoke only sank him deeper into the pit of disconnection he had dug himself. After the arguments concluded, Judge Annabelle Sterling stood motionless, her eyes scanning the faces of everyone involved. The silence in the room was absolute, charged with an almost painful anticipation. Everyone expected an instant verdict, a swift resolution to the unfolding drama. However, Judge Sterling was not a woman of hasty decisions, especially when a child's life was at stake. She slowly removed her glasses, the gesture heightening the tension. "This court has listened to the facts and the feelings with equal attention," she said, her voice formal but with a tone of seriousness that indicated the depth of her consideration. "Given the complexity of the human issues presented today, this court will now recess. Deliberation will take 1 hour. We will resume at 3 o'clock for the reading of the sentence." The sound of the gavel was like the final ticking of a time bomb, beginning an hour of pure agony for James and Sarah. Stepping out of the courtroom into the hallway was like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The reporters were still there, but their energy had shifted. Their aggression had been replaced by respectful curiosity. No one shouted questions. Instead, a corridor was opened for them, their eyes following Sarah with a newfound admiration. She was no longer the subject of a scandal. She was the protagonist of a story of courage. James kept a protective hand on her back, but now the gesture felt less like a bodyguard and more like a proud partner. Maria led them to a small private waiting room, a sterile, silent oasis to await the final storm or the sunrise. The door closed, isolating them from the world, but imprisoning them within their own thoughts. As soon as the door closed, the strength that had sustained Sarah throughout the testimony deserted her. Her legs buckled and she sat abruptly in a chair, her body trembling with the delayed reaction to stress. The adrenaline gave way to an overwhelming exhaustion, a feeling of being drained of everything. She buried her face in her hands and, for the first time that day, allowed herself to cry. They were silent, deep sobs, from a woman who had bared her soul to the world. She had exposed her oldest wounds, defended her purest love, and now there was nothing left to do. The uncertainty was torture. What if her words hadn't been enough? What if the cold logic of the law overcame the truth of her heart? The fear of losing Daniel, of being ripped from the family she had helped rebuild, was a physical pain, sharp and searing. James stood still for a moment, watching her cry, feeling a pang of helplessness he rarely experienced. All his power, all his wealth, could not shield her from that pain. He approached and, in a gesture that defied the very nature of the man he had been, knelt before her. He offered no cliched comfort. He simply waited for her sobs to subside. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice hoarse and low, thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I don't know what that woman will decide, but I know what I saw. I saw the strongest person I've ever known. You didn't just speak for Daniel. You spoke for everyone who has ever felt invisible. Whatever happens, what you did there was a victory. You gave me back my son. You gave me back myself." His words, spoken with such raw sincerity, were more effective than any hug. Sarah lifted her face, her eyes red and puffy, and looked at the man kneeling before her. The imposing CEO was gone, replaced by a vulnerable man, a grateful father, and she realized that the transformation hadn't been hers alone. He, too, had been transformed by this ordeal. "I only spoke what was in my heart," she whispered. "Your heart," he replied, "is the safest place Daniel and I have ever known." And in that moment, in that cold waiting room, the last barrier between them dissolved. They were no longer the boss and the employee, the rich man and the humble woman. They were just James and Sarah, two castaways who had found a lifeboat in each other. The next hour was the longest of their lives. Time stretched and contracted, marked only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. They didn't say much, they didn't need to. The silence that settled between them was a companionable silence, a stillness that was living proof of the truth Sarah had championed on the stand. It was the kind of silence she had taught James not to fear. Amidst their anxiety, their thoughts constantly returned to Daniel, who waited in another room, blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama. The image of his face, his rare smile, was what kept them sane. It was for him. Everything was for him. The urge to return to the simplicity of their world, to build a tower of blocks or read a story, was a desire so strong it hurt. The knock on the door was like a gunshot in the silence. They both jumped. The same court official stood there, her expression impassive. "The judge is ready for you." The words, spoken in a neutral tone, seemed to carry the weight of the world. Anxiety returned with a vengeance, a metallic taste in his mouth. James stood first, extending his hand to help Sarah up. Their hands touched, cold and clammy, but the grip was firm. They exchanged one last look, a silent pact to face whatever lay ahead, together. The walk back to the courtroom was surreal. Every step was deliberate. Every breath counted. They were walking toward their future, for better or worse, and the whole world seemed to have stopped to watch. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed again. It was charged with a palpable electricity, the stillness of final anticipation. The prosecution's attorneys seemed visibly tense, their postures no longer arrogant but defensive. James's rival, who had previously seemed like a predator, now looked like a man awaiting his own sentence. As James and Sarah took their seats, the entire courtroom seemed to lean toward them. They were the epicenter of this drama, and the verdict to come would be not just a legal decision, but a moral judgment that everyone in the room felt had already been decided in their hearts, but still needed the sanction of the law. Judge Sterling entered with the same formality as before, but there was a new expression on her face, one of resolution. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at James and Sarah, ignoring the lawyers for a moment. "This court has deliberated on the issues presented," she began, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the silence. "This case presented a conflict not just between two parties, but between two worldviews, one based on rules and protocol, and the other based on human connection and empathy. This court's task is to reconcile the two within the framework of the law, always with the best interests of the child as our only true compass." Her words set the stage for a decision she knew would be closely watched. She turned first to the prosecution table, and her tone hardened. "I must begin by addressing the nature of the initial complaint. The evidence presented by the defense strongly suggests that Child's Agency Protective Services was cynically and maliciously used as a weapon in a corporate dispute. Using the well-being of a child with special needs as a pawn in a business game is an act of moral depravity that this court condemns in the strongest possible terms. The allegations of negligence and endangerment, therefore, are not only baseless, they are an affront to the decency and purpose of this judicial system. All claims against Mr. James Ashford are therefore summarily dismissed." A sigh of relief swept across the defense table, but the judge was not finished yet. Her eyes shifted to James and Sarah, and her tone softened, becoming professorial. "That said, the court recognizes that the care situation at the Ashford residence is indeed atypical. Ms. Jenkins, despite her undeniable bond with the child, does not possess the certifications that would normally be required of a full-time caregiver for a child with Daniel's diagnosis. The law and protocols exist for a reason, to create a standard of care and protect against potential harm. Therefore, the court had to seriously consider whether the current arrangement, despite its good intentions, met the legal standards of adequacy." Sarah's heart, which had begun to calm, began to pound wildly again. The cold logic of the law could still separate them. "However," the judge continued, and that single word changed everything, "the law also allows us to consider individual circumstances and the totality of the evidence. And the most compelling evidence presented in this court today came not from a report or an expert, but from the testimony of Ms. Sarah Jenkins. She provided us with a window into Daniel Ashford's world, a world not of deficit, but of difference. She proved beyond a reasonable doubt that his lack of qualifications on paper is vastly outweighed by his profound qualifications in humanity, patience, and understanding. She demonstrated that the environment she created for Daniel is not just safe, it is an environment of healing and flourishing." Judge Sterling looked directly at Sarah, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. "Competence in this case cannot be measured by a diploma. It is measured by a child's smile, by the trust demonstrated through a simple stone, and by the gradual return of a soul from an abyss of silence. It would be a grave miscarriage of justice and a human tragedy to dismantle such a clearly beneficial environment in the name of rigid compliance with protocols. Therefore, this court's decision is that the current care arrangement is not only permitted, but affirmed to be in the best and highest interests of the child, Daniel Ashford. Case dismissed. The sound of the final gavel was like thunder, followed by stunned silence. It took a second for the reality of those words to sink in. They had won. They hadn't just been acquitted. They had been validated. The first to react was Sarah. A breath she'd felt like she'd been holding for months escaped her lips in an audible sob. The tears she'd fought so hard to hold back now flowed freely, not from pain, but from a relief so profound it was almost painful. Beside her, James Ashford, the titan of industry, the master of control, collapsed in his chair. He hung his head, his broad shoulders shaking with the weight of released emotion. The armor had finally cracked, and the man beneath it was just a grateful, exhausted father. Forgetting where they were, the reporters, the lawyers, James turned to Sarah. He said nothing. He simply pulled her into a hug that had nothing restrained or formal about it. It was the embrace of two souls who had faced the abyss together and survived. He held her tightly, as if to reassure himself that she was real, that this moment was real. Sarah clung to him, her face buried in his shoulder, crying freely. In that embrace, in the middle of a courtroom, they weren't the billionaire and the cleaning lady. They were a family forged in fire, united by the fight for a boy who had taught them everything that truly mattered. As the room erupted into a buzz of conversation and the camera flashes began to flash again, Judge Sterling banged her gavel one last time, demanding silence. "Order!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted, confused. The case was over. She waited until stillness returned. Then she did something no one expected. She looked directly at the defense table, passing over the lawyers, and fixed her gaze on Sarah. "Ms. Jenkins," she said, her voice formal again but with an underlying tone of something personal. "Would you please come to the bench?" A new kind of silence fell over the room, the silence of astonishment. What could the judge possibly want with her in particular? Sarah pulled away from James's embrace, her face tear-stained but her eyes clear. She looked at Maria, her attorney, who looked as surprised as she was, but gave a small nod of encouragement. Hesitantly, feeling the eyes of the entire room on her, Sarah stood and walked toward the imposing wooden bench. She felt small before this structure, before the woman who held the power over her future. The judge leaned forward, creating a bubble of privacy in the middle of the public room, her voice lowering to a conversational tone. What she said next was not in any court record, not part of any legal proceeding, but it would be the final and most unexpected validation of all. Sophia didn't seek a new life. She simply understood a pain she already knew. And in doing so, she not only gave a voice back to a boy lost in silence, but also a heart back to a father lost in grief. Sometimes the world teaches us to value the noisy things, power, money, success. But the greatest transformations happen in the stillness of an empathetic gesture and in the courage to see someone for who they truly are, not for what they appear to be. Their journey reminds us that the greatest qualification we can have is a heart willing to hear the unspoken language. If this story touched your soul, as it did Sophia, Daniel, and Alejandro's, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that prove to us that the greatest act of courage is simply staying. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Feeling the eyes of the entire room on her, Sarah stood and walked slowly toward the judge's imposing bench. Her heart, which had begun to calm, began pounding again, but this time with curiosity, not fear. She stopped before the woman who held so much power, the arbiter of her fate. Judge Sterling leaned forward, her voice lowering to a confidential tone, creating a bubble of intimacy amidst the formality of the courtroom. "Ms. Jenkins," she said, her eyes filled with an emotion she no longer hid. "My oldest son is a teacher at a school for children with special needs. For years he has told me stories about the frustration of fighting a system that values forms more than people. Today, for the first time, I truly understood what he meant. You didn't just defend a child. You taught this court a lesson in humanity. The world desperately needs more people with your qualifications." Sarah was speechless, completely stunned by the unexpected moment of human connection. She had come prepared for a legal verdict, not a personal acquittal from the most powerful figure in the room. Those words, spoken in confidence, were the final validation. a seal on her soul that was more meaningful than any judicial decision. The judge saw her not as a cleaner or a caregiver, but as an equal, an expert in a field the law itself often ignored. A lump formed in her throat, and all she could do was nod slowly, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. Judge Sterling simply gave her a small, encouraging nod, a gesture that said, "Keep going. What you do matters." In that instant, Sarah felt that her journey, with all its pain and hardship, had found a purpose greater than she could have ever dreamed. The final exit from the courthouse was a surreal experience. The throng of reporters still thronged outside, but the predatory atmosphere had dissipated. In its place, there was an almost palpable respect. The microphones were still outstretched, but the questions were softer. "Mrs. Jenkins, how are you feeling? What advice would you give to other families?" She had no ready answers. Her mind was still processing the day's emotional roller coaster. She could only manage a small, tired smile, a smile that contained an ocean of relief and exhaustion. James, always at her side, put a protective arm around her shoulders and guided her through the crowd toward the waiting car. He didn't need to say a word to the press. The image of them walking together, a team united by adversity and victory, told the whole story more eloquently than any headline. Once inside the silent sanctuary of the car, a different kind of stillness enveloped them. It wasn't the tense silence of the morning, but a gentle, grounded silence, like the calm after a great storm. Sarah leaned her head against the cool glass and closed her eyes, letting the images and sounds of the day pass through her mind. The lawyer's mocking face, the judge's intense gaze, the grip of James's hand, the small gray stone in her palm. It felt like a lifetime had been lived in those few hours. She felt empty but also strangely full. Beside her, James was also still, watching the Connecticut landscape pass by. But this time he seemed to actually see it. The autumn colors, the light of the setting sun. It was as if the world had regained its color, its life, now that the threat had been removed. Ashford Mansion, which in the morning had seemed like a cold stone fortress, now loomed at the end of the long driveway like a welcoming beacon. The lights burning in the windows no longer seemed distant and impersonal. They seemed warm and inviting. It was the picture of home. As the car pulled up and the driver opened the door, Sarah breathed in the fresh, familiar air of the estate. The scent of pine trees and damp earth had never sounded so sweet. Each step toward the grand front door was a step away from the nightmare and toward her new reality, a reality she had fought to protect and that now awaited her with open arms. They weren't just returning to a home. They were returning to the sanctuary they had defended and won together. The greatest prize of all awaited them on the other side of that door. The door opened to reveal James's cousin, a kind woman who had cared for Daniel during the day. Her face lit up with a smile of relief at the sight of them. And then, in the middle of the vast entry hall, Daniel stood, holding his smooth gray stone, watching them with his serious, discerning eyes. He didn't run or shout. He was an observer, a sensor of emotions, and he was absorbing the completely transformed energy in the room. The tension was gone. The anxiety had dissipated. In its place was an exhausted calm and a radiant joy. He looked at his father's face, then at Sarah's, processing the change in their postures, the softness in their eyes. The storm was over, and his two headlights were home. With silent deliberation, Daniel took his first step. He walked directly to his father. James immediately knelt down, bringing himself to his son's level, his heart pounding with anticipation. Daniel stopped in front of him and, with a gentleness that belied his age, reached out with his free hand and touched James's cheek. It was a light touch, almost a question, a gesture of comfort that said everything words couldn't. It was Daniel acknowledging his father's struggle, offering his own kind of healing. James closed his eyes, a lone tear escaping and rolling down his cheek to meet his son's fingers. In that touch, he received the absolution he hadn't known he needed, the confirmation that he was, after all, a good father in the eyes of the only person whose opinion truly mattered. Then Daniel turned to Sarah, who was also kneeling on the marble floor, her heart overflowing. He approached her, his dark eyes fixed on hers, and extended the hand holding the stone of calm. He placed it gently in Sarah's palm. It was his greatest treasure, the symbol of his security, and he was giving it to her. It was his thank you, his I trust you, his you kept me safe. Sarah closed her hand around the stone, feeling its warmth and weight. Tears streamed down her face now, but they were tears of such pure, intense joy that they seemed to wash away all the pain of the past. She thought her heart could never be fuller, but she was wrong. The greatest miracle of the day was yet to come. Looking directly into Sarah's eyes with a concentration that seemed to gather all the energy in his small body, Daniel opened his mouth. He took a deep breath, and a sound emerged, hesitant at first, but then gaining clarity. A single word, uttered with an effort and intention that made it the most beautiful word in the world. Home. He didn't point to the mansion. He looked at Sarah. She was home. The word, a whisper in the vast hall, echoed like thunder in the hearts of Sarah and James. It was the first word James had heard from his son in over 2 years. For Sarah, it was the final validation of everything she believed. It was proof that when they feel safe and understood, even the quietest worlds can find a voice. Sarah couldn't answer. She simply opened her arms, and Daniel threw himself into them, wrapping his little arms around her neck in a tight, trusting embrace. She held him, rocking him gently, her face buried in his hair, inhaling the scent of childhood and victory. James, watching the scene, was completely overcome with emotion. He moved and enveloped them in a huge hug, uniting the three of them in a circle of relief, joy, and love. There, on the cool marble floor of their immense home, they became, in that instant, a family. Not by blood, not by law, but by their mutual choice to stay together, to protect and heal each other. The battle was over. Life, real life, was just beginning. That night, the celebration was of a simplicity that would have shocked any of James's business associates. There was no expensive champagne or dinner at a fancy restaurant. Instead, they gathered in the spacious, welcoming kitchen. James, sleeves rolled up and with awkward determination, made pancakes for dinner at Daniel's request. Flour coated part of his expensive shirt, and he laughed at his own ineptitude. Sarah prepared fresh fruit, and Daniel sat at the granite island, swinging his legs and emitting little hums of happiness. The conversation was light, about nothing and everything. It was the sounds of normal domestic life, a symphony of banalities that, for them, was the most beautiful music in the world, the sound of the peace they had achieved. Later, after Daniel went to bed, falling asleep almost instantly with a smile on his face, James and Sarah sat on the back porch. The cool autumn air enveloped them, but they felt warm inside. "Sarah," James began, his voice serious, "I've spoken with my lawyers. I want to start the process of naming you Daniel's legal guardian, alongside me. I don't want you to be an employee. I don't want a contract to define us. I want you to be my partner in this, in raising him, in his life, in our lives." The offer was monumental, a complete redefinition of their world. He was offering her not just a job or a place to live, but a permanent place in their lives, an equal share in their family. Sarah looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the dark Connecticut sky. She thought of her journey, from the lonely cleaning lady who arrived at that door to the woman sitting there now receiving an offer beyond her wildest dreams. She didn't need time to think. The answer had long been engraved in her heart. She turned to James, her face illuminated by the soft light coming from inside the house, and smiled. "I would love to, James," she said, her voice calm and sure. "There's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be." Her yes wasn't just an acceptance of an offer. It was a confirmation of belonging, a declaration that she had finally, after a long journey, found her true home. Ashford Mansion transform. The quiet, formal rooms began to fill with life. A painting easel appeared in the sunroom for Daniel's art projects. The sound of the piano, which had been silent since Anna's death, returned, with James patiently teaching Daniel to play simple melodies. The house, once a showcase for interior design, began to accumulate the happy clutter of a life lived. A lost sneaker in the hallway, drawings pinned with magnets to the stainless steel refrigerator, the constant smell of cookies baking in the oven. The wealth was still there, but it had become the backdrop, not the focal point. The true luxury of the house now lay in the abundance of laughter and the ease with which they moved together in the space. The small, smooth gray stone found pride of place on a shelf in the library, next to a newly framed photo of the three of them together, taken on a sunny day in the garden. The small object stood there as a silent monument to their journey. It was a constant reminder that the greatest strength often lies in the simplest things, that trust is built in small gestures, and that security is not a stone fortress, but the feeling of knowing someone will hold your fears as if they were their own. Every now and then, Sarah or James would pick up the stone, feeling its weight and smoothness, and smile, remembering the day it became irrefutable proof that love was the only evidence that mattered. One night, James stood in his office holding an old photo of his wife, Anna. He traced her smile with his finger. "I finally understand, my love," he whispered to the image. "I thought honoring you meant preserving everything as it was, keeping your memory frozen in time. But I was wrong. Honoring you is living. It's allowing joy back in. It's being the father you always knew I could be." He no longer felt guilty about being happy. Instead, he felt he was sharing this new happiness with her, that she was a benevolent part of his rebuilding. He placed Anna's photo next to the new photo of the three of them, uniting their past and present into a single beautiful story of love, loss, and rebirth. In her room, now filled with her books and small keepsakes, Sarah picked up the faded photo of her brother Kevin. She held it close to her heart. "We did it, Kevin," she whispered. This time, the story was different. This time the boy was seen. He was heard. The pain of her loss would never completely disappear, but it had transformed. It was no longer an open wound, but a scar that reminded her of her own strength and the depth of her capacity to love. She had transformed the greatest pain of her life into another's greatest gift, and in doing so, she had healed in a way she never thought possible. She had found peace, not by forgetting her past, but by giving it a new and beautiful purpose. With a new sense of clarity, Sarah took the business card Judge Sterling had given her. The judge's offer wasn't just a career opportunity, it was a calling. Her journey with Daniel had prepared her for something greater. She knew there were countless other children like him and Kevin, children whose unique languages were being ignored by a world too busy to listen. She didn't know exactly what her path would be, whether it would be through activism, consulting, or volunteer work, but she knew she could no longer remain silent. Her personal experience had given her a powerful voice, and she felt a moral responsibility to use it to fight for those who had not yet been found. The Greenwich, Connecticut house, once a symbol of cold wealth and isolation, became a beacon of a different kind of success. Visitors expecting formality and sterile luxury were surprised to find a home filled with warmth, art, and the occasional sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. The Ashford mansion became a living testament to the truth they had discovered, that the true richness of a life is not measured in stocks and property, but in moments of genuine connection, in the security of knowing one belongs, and in the joy of watching those we love flourish. It was a home built not on a foundation of money, but on a foundation of empathy. The story of that chapter of their lives ends on a spring afternoon in the vast backyard. James is pushing Daniel on the swing, higher and higher, and Daniel's laughter, now a common and wonderful occurrence, floats through the air like music. Sarah watches them from a nearby bench, a serene smile on her face. She no longer sees a boss and a child she cares for. She sees her partner and his son. She sees her family whole and happy. The sun begins to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, and a feeling of deep and lasting peace settles over them. They had proven to themselves and to the world that the most daunting barriers can be broken down, not with power or force, but with the simple, revolutionary courage to stop, listen, and learn the silent language of the heart. Sarah didn't seek a fortune. She simply recognized a pain she knew for a long time, and by healing that pain in others, she found her own peace, restoring a voice to a boy and a soul to a father. Sometimes life places us in places we don't understand, surrounding us with silence and solitude. But their journey reminds us that it is in stillness that true communication happens, and that the most important qualification we can have is a heart willing to learn the other's language. If this story touched your heart, as it did Sarah, James, and Daniel's, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that remind us of what really matters, seeing beyond appearances and listening with the soul.